Professor James Harrington's seminar room fell silent as he closed the leather-bound volume of Schopenhauer's essays. These categorizations of women weren't merely philosophical musings, he explained. They were warnings, deeply embedded in 19th century anxieties about changing gender roles. Emma Parker adjusted her glasses, her notebook already filled with questions. At 28, she'd navigated academia's subtle misogyny with quiet determination, but Schopenhauer's explicit categorization struck a nerve. For this semester, Harrington continued, I want each of you to examine one of Schopenhauer's female archetypes that men were warned to avoid. Emma raised her hand. I'd like to explore these archetypes through narrative inquiry, examining the actual women behind these labels, both historically and today. After class, Thomas Reed approached her, his usual academic reserve softened by genuine interest. Your approach is fascinating. Mind if I join your research? My focus on philosophical categorizations seems complementary. Emma hesitated. Thomas had always been respectful but distant in their previous collaborations. I promise not to channel Schopenhauer, he added with a self-deprecating smile. That's setting the bar rather low, Emma replied, returning the smile. But yes, let's collaborate. Neither realized how this academic exercise would unveil not just Schopenhauer's prejudices, but their own unexamined assumptions about gender, ambition, and human connection. The university archives smelled of dust and preservation chemicals as Emma carefully turned pages of a first-edition Schopenhauer. Listen to this, she said, pointing to a passage. The woman who pursues intellectual matters beyond domestic concerns disrupts the natural order. Her pretense at philosophical thought is mere decoration, like jewelry worn to entrap men. Thomas grimaced. Not exactly subtle, is he? What's fascinating, Emma replied, is how threatened he was by female intellectual autonomy. Behind the contempt lies profound insecurity. Their research led them to correspondence between Harriet Taylor Mill and John Stuart Mill, whose intellectual partnership represented everything Schopenhauer warned against. Later that week, Emma interviewed Dr. Eleanor Winters, a philosophy professor emerita who'd entered academia in the 1960s. They called us blue stockings, Dr. Winters recalled, her voice steady despite the painful memories. My doctoral advisor told me directly that women lacked the logical rigor for true philosophical inquiry. Sound familiar? Emma nodded. Schopenhauer's ghost lingered well into the 20th century, and still whispers today, Dr. Winters added, just in more polite language. Schopenhauer was particularly fixated on beautiful women, Thomas noted during their weekly research meeting. He called beauty a woman's trap for men's reason. Emma scrolled through her research notes. He wrote that beauty exists solely to perpetuate the species, and once it fades, nothing of value remains. Their investigation led them to the journals of Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, the 18th century portrait artist whose beauty often overshadowed discussion of her considerable talent. For contemporary perspective, Emma interviewed Maria Solano, a prominent architect whose media coverage consistently emphasized her appearance over her award-winning designs. The first question in interviews is rarely about my work, Maria explained, as they sat in her minimalist office. It's about how I manage it all, while staying so put together. My male colleagues get asked about their creative process. Thomas, who had insisted on observing the interview, shifted uncomfortably. I've never thought about how that undermines professional women. That's the insidious part, Maria replied. These aren't hostile questions. They're asked admiringly. But they still reduce me to decoration, exactly as Schopenhauer would have it. The seminar room buzzed with discussion as Emma and Thomas presented their preliminary findings. Schopenhauer reserved special contempt for ambitious women. Emma explained. He considered female ambition not merely unattractive, but morally suspect, a perversion of natural order. Thomas displayed images of Marie Curie and Rosalind Franklin. These scientists faced extraordinary barriers. Franklin's crucial work on DNA structure was appropriated by male colleagues, while Curie was accused of merely assisting her husband despite her independent brilliance. Professor Harrington nodded. And these attitudes persisted well beyond Schopenhauer's time. After class, Thomas confessed something to Emma. My mother abandoned a promising medical career when she married my father. I always assumed it was her choice, but now I wonder what pressures she faced. Have you asked her? Emma inquired. I never thought to, he admitted. Some silences become so familiar, you stop noticing them. Emma's apartment was littered with books, coffee cups, and research notes when Thomas arrived for their study session. Schopenhauer's views on motherhood were fascinatingly contradictory, she began. He simultaneously venerated motherhood as women's highest purpose, while dismissing mothers as intellectually limited by their biological function. Thomas nodded, and he especially condemned women who chose not to become mothers. As unnatural aberrations, Emma quoted. Yet he never married or had children himself. Their research led them to historical cases of women whose scientific or artistic contributions were possible only because they remained childless, often facing severe social consequences for this choice. Later that week, Emma interviewed Dr. Leila Chen, a renowned neurosurgeon. People still ask when I'm going to have children, as though my work saving lives is somehow incomplete without motherhood, Dr. Chen explained. No one asks my male colleagues if their professional achievements fulfill them without fatherhood. Thomas, taking notes for their project, paused. I've never thought about the asymmetry of those expectations. That's how cultural norms work, Dr. Chen replied. They're invisible until you're the one they constrain. Schopenhauer had particular disdain for widows who didn't retreat into permanent mourning, Emma explained during their presentation to Professor Harrington. He saw their potential independence, especially financial independence, as threatening. Thomas displayed historical documents showing how widowhood sometimes offered women unprecedented autonomy in property ownership, business management, and social freedom, precisely what concerned Schopenhauer. For their case study, they interviewed Elaine Barrett, who at 72 had rebuilt her life after her husband's early death, eventually founding a successful educational non-profit. For 40 years, I was primarily Michael's wife, Elaine told them. After he died, people expected me to define myself by his absence. Instead, I finally discovered who I was, beyond that relationship. Professor Harrington nodded thoughtfully. You're uncovering something important here. Schopenhauer's categories reveal more about male insecurity than female nature. Exactly, Emma replied. His warnings weren't protecting men from dangerous women, but from women discovering their own power. Schopenhauer believed women lacked true creative genius, Thomas began in their weekly meeting. He argued that while women might mimic artistic expression, they couldn't access the transcendent vision he associated with male creativity. Emma nodded. Yet his era was filled with female artists working under male pseudonyms or in mediums dismissed as feminine crafts rather than fine art. Their research took them to the overlooked correspondence of Emily Dickinson and the posthumously recognized paintings of Hilma af Klint, whose abstract works predated male artists typically credited with pioneering abstraction. For contemporary insight, they interviewed Maya Nguyen, whose experimental films had recently gained international recognition. The language of criticism still reveals these biases, Maya explained. My work is described as emotionally evocative, while my male Peers create intellectually challenging films. Schopenhauer would recognize this distinction immediately. Thomas considered this. It's a way of acknowledging talent while simultaneously diminishing it. Exactly, Maya replied. And after enough time hearing your work described this way, you begin to question your own vision. Emma's research led them to Schopenhauer's warnings about women with financial acumen. He considered women incapable of managing money responsibly, she explained. Any woman who demonstrated financial intelligence was characterized as calculating and untrustworthy. They discovered historical records of successful female investors and business owners who operated through male proxies or faced extraordinary legal barriers. For their contemporary perspective, they interviewed Rebecca Goldman, a hedge fund manager whose firm consistently outperformed market averages. Finance remains stubbornly male-dominated, Rebecca explained. The qualities praised in my male colleagues, assertiveness, strategic risk-taking, analytical thinking, are often criticized when I display them. During their post-interview discussion, Thomas admitted, I've caught myself thinking, successful. Business women must be somehow harder or less compassionate than other women. That's exactly what Schopenhauer was codifying, Emma replied. The assumption that traditionally masculine domains require abandoning feminine virtues, creating a no-win situation for women who enter these fields. As their project developed, Emma and Thomas examined Schopenhauer's paradoxical warnings about women skilled in conversation. He simultaneously criticized women for trivial conversation and feared those whose speech demonstrated depth and insight, Emma explained in their presentation. The ideal woman, by his standard, spoke primarily to affirm and support male ideas. Their historical research uncovered salon hostesses whose intellectual gatherings shaped European thought, though their own contributions were rarely credited. For their contemporary case study, they interviewed Dr. Sophia Williams, a renowned debate coach whose teams had won national championships. In competitive debate, we still see judges rating identical arguments higher when presented by male voices, Dr. Williams explained. Female debaters walk a tightrope between being too aggressive or not assertive enough. Professor Harrington nodded. Schopenhauer's categories persisted because they reinforced existing power structures. Identifying these patterns is the first step toward dismantling them. Schopenhauer considered women fundamentally unsuited for political thought. Thomas explained as they organized their research. He claimed they lacked the rational objectivity necessary for governing. Emma uncovered historical documents about political women who had been systematically erased from historical narratives. Female advisors to kings, influential diplomats' wives, and underground activists. Their contributions had to be disguised, Emma noted, often as domestic or social activities that masked their political influence. Their research led them to Congresswoman Diana Richardson, whose 20-year political career spanned major legislative achievements despite persistent media focus on her appearance and family life. When I first ran for office, Diana told them over coffee in her district office, a journalist asked if I was concerned that politics would interfere with my maternal responsibilities. My opponent, a father of 3, was asked about his economic policy. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. The double standard is so blatant once you start noticing it. And exhausting to navigate, Diana added. Every woman in politics learns to anticipate these questions, to prepare answers that won't trigger the emotional label while still appearing authentic and relatable. Schopenhauer claimed that women's minds were incapable of true scholarly depth, Emma noted as they combed through university archives. He argued they could absorb knowledge, but never truly master it. Thomas discovered records of female scholars who published under male pseudonyms or collaborated with male colleagues who often received primary credit. For their contemporary interview, they spoke with Dr. Anita Sharma, whose groundbreaking work in quantum physics had initially been dismissed by peers. The resistance wasn't overt, Dr. Sharma explained as she showed them her laboratory. It was subtle. Questions that presumed incompetence, suggestions that my results required additional verification, invitations to conferences mysteriously lost. Later, while organizing their notes, Thomas paused. I've been noticing something in our interviews. The women we've spoken with, they're all exceptional in their fields, yet they describe having to be twice as rigorous, twice as prepared as their male counterparts. Emma nodded. That's the point. Schopenhauer's categories created impossible standards. To be taken seriously, women had to be exceptional, and even then their contributions were questioned. It's exhausting just hearing about it, Thomas admitted. I can't imagine living it daily. Now you're beginning to understand, Emma replied quietly. This is perhaps Schopenhauer's most contradictory category, Emma explained during their research update. He simultaneously condemned women as dangerously sexual creatures who distracted men from higher pursuits while also criticizing them for using sexuality as power. Their historical research uncovered painful accounts of women labeled as deviant for expressing sexual autonomy or desire outside socially prescribed boundaries. For their contemporary perspective, they interviewed Dr. Jasmine Rodriguez, a sexuality researcher whose work challenged persistent double standards. The Madonna-whore dichotomy. Schopenhauer reinforced still shapes cultural narratives, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Women's sexuality is simultaneously commodified and controlled, celebrated and shameful. After the interview, walking across campus, in the autumn chill, Thomas confessed, I've never considered how philosophical categories like Schopenhauer's might have shaped my own assumptions about women's sexuality. Emma glanced at him. How so? I catch myself making unconscious judgments about women's clothing choices, relationship decisions, based on standards I've never actually questioned, he admitted. This research is making me uncomfortable with my own thought patterns. Good, Emma replied simply. That discomfort is how growth begins. Schopenhauer was particularly cruel about women aging, Emma noted as they compiled their research. He suggested that a woman's worth diminished in direct proportion to her fading, youth and beauty. Their historical investigation revealed societies where older women were valued for wisdom and experience, contrasted with cultures that rendered aging women increasingly invisible. For their contemporary insight, they interviewed Victoria Lang, a 75-year-old former model who had become an advocate for age representation in media. The fear of aging that Schopenhauer weaponized against women has become a multi-billion-dollar industry, Victoria explained in her sun-filled apartment. We're sold products promising to help us fight or combat aging, as though growing older were an enemy to be vanquished rather than a natural process to be honored. Thomas was struck by the vitality and clarity in Victoria's presence. You seem to have rejected that narrative entirely. Victoria smiled. It wasn't easy. I spent decades internalizing the message that my value was tied to my appearance. Unlearning, that has been my life's most liberating work. Later, Emma observed, what's striking is how Schopenhauer's categories trap women at every stage of life. Too young to be taken seriously, too old to be valued. Thomas nodded. The perfect system to ensure women always feel insufficient. As their project neared completion, Emma and Thomas explored Schopenhauer's views on women in professional roles. He considered professional ambition in women as fundamentally unnatural, Thomas explained during their seminar presentation. Any woman seeking expertise outside domestic spheres was viewed as violating natural law. Their historical research uncovered women who practiced medicine, law, and engineering despite extraordinary barriers, often operating underground or through male intermediaries. For their contemporary interview, they spoke with Judge Miriam Stone, whose 30-year legal career had culminated in her appointment to the federal bench. The expectations are impossibly contradictory, Judge Stone explained in her chambers. Show too much emotion and you're dismissed as hysterical. Show too little and you're cold and unlikable. These aren't just social judgments. They impact hiring, promotion, and credibility assessments. After the interview, walking to the campus coffee shop, Thomas asked Emma, "Do you experience these contradictions in academia?" Emma was quiet for a moment. "When I speak passionately about research, male colleagues have called it emotional investment rather than intellectual conviction. When I present methodical evidence, I've been described as rigid rather than thorough. It's exhausting to constantly navigate these invisible boundaries." Thomas nodded slowly. "I've never had to think about how I present my enthusiasm or conviction." "That's the privilege Schopenhauer was protecting," Emma replied, as they prepared. For their final presentation, Thomas arrived at Emma's apartment with coffee and unexpected news. "I spoke with my mother," he said, setting down the cups. "About her medical career." Emma looked up from her notes. "What did she say?" "She told me she didn't abandon her career. She was systematically pushed out. When she became pregnant with me, her residency director suggested taking time to focus on family. When she tried to return, positions mysteriously disappeared. Eventually, the message became clear. Medicine could accommodate male doctors with families, but not mothers." Thomas sat heavily on Emma's couch. "All these years, I carried this narrative that she'd chosen family over career, a narrative that subtly informed my understanding of women's natural priorities. The truth was much uglier." Emma set aside her laptop. "How did it feel to hear that?" "Infuriating," Thomas admitted, "not just because of what happened to her, but because I never questioned the story. I accepted it because it fit so neatly into cultural expectations Schopenhauer helped codify." "This is why our project matters," Emma said quietly. "These aren't just historical curiosities. They're living categories that still shape lives today." Thomas nodded slowly. "I understand now why you wanted to examine these archetypes through real women's experiences. The philosophical categorizations aren't abstract. They're personal." The department auditorium was filled. For their final presentation, Professor Harrington introduced them with evident pride, noting how their project had evolved beyond a simple philosophical analysis. Emma began, "We set out to examine Schopenhauer's warnings about women men should avoid. What we discovered was how these categories weren't merely descriptive, they were prescriptive, creating boundaries that still constrain women's lives today." Thomas continued, "Through historical research and contemporary interviews, we found that women who defied these categories weren't anomalies to be avoided, as Schopenhauer warned. They were individuals refusing artificial limitations on their humanity." Their presentation moved through each category, connecting Schopenhauer's warnings to both historical contexts and present realities, illustrated with powerful quotes from their interviews. Emma concluded, "The women Schopenhauer warned men to avoid weren't dangerous because of any inherent quality. They were dangerous because they challenged systems of power that benefited from women's constraint. They refused to be less than fully human." During the applause that followed, Thomas leaned toward Emma. "Thank you for allowing me to be part of this. It's changed how I see everything, really." Emma smiled. "That's the thing about categorical thinking. Once you start questioning one boundary, you begin to see them everywhere." As they gathered their materials after the presentation, Professor Harrington approached them. "Exceptional work, both of you. What's next for this research?" Emma and Thomas exchanged glances. Their collaboration had evolved from academic convenience to genuine intellectual partnership. We're thinking of expanding it into a book, Emma replied, examining how philosophical categorizations of women throughout history have shaped contemporary gender expectations. And how these categories can be dismantled, Thomas added. Professor Harrington nodded approvingly. I look forward to reading it. He paused, then added, Schopenhauer would have hated it, of course. Emma smiled. We're counting on that. As they left the auditorium into the crisp autumn evening, their conversation turned to next steps. Research, grants, publishing possibilities, conference presentations. But beneath the professional planning lay a deeper understanding that the most dangerous categories are those we accept without question, and that freedom begins when we recognize the boundaries we've been taught not to cross.